The Schiit Midgard headphone amplifier and preamp contains some technology that we've literally never seen before in this hobby of ours. That includes super high-end speaker amps, super high-end headphone amps. Nothing has ever done this before. And so I was really excited to get my hands on this one, try measuring it, see if the technology in here, which is called the Halo technology, if that makes any difference. And I have to say that the results are a bit mixed. And I say they're a bit mixed because the measurements don't really show much, but the sound quality is kind of interesting. So let's talk about that. Coming in at $219, the Midgard's pretty special because it's so cheap and yet it is coming with a brand new tech that we've never seen before. Now, the reason for that, according to Jason Stoddard from Schiit Audio, is that they aren't really sure what this Halo technology is going to do, how effective it's going to be, and so they've just decided to release it to the world and let us decide. And I mean us as in all of us, not just audio reviewers, but everybody that might buy and listen to a $220 amplifier. What you're getting for your $219 is a fully discrete amplifier, meaning that the amplification is handled by individual components such as transistors, resistors, etc., not just a single integrated chip. It also includes the Halo technology, and I'm going to talk about that at the very end of this review. I'm going to kick off with the sound quality, what I heard listening to it and comparing it with other headphone amplifiers. So I will explain Halo technology, I'll give you a device tour, I'll talk about features and functions at the end. But the summary so far is it's a $219 headphone amp, it's fully discrete, it's got the Halo feedback technology, and it'll produce 4.8 watts into a 32 ohm load, making it very powerful, and still has 750 milliwatts into a 300 ohm headphone load, so plenty of power on tap at any impedance. Jumping straight into what you're probably here for, and that's sound quality. The sound from the Midgard is what I would call as clean, but not sterile. It's got a crisp sound with excellent image focus, but there's no lack of soul to the music as well. The soundstage it produces is quite wide, not particularly deep, but very enjoyable. It's not a wall of sound headphone amplifier, it does have some depth, just not as big as some premium amplifiers. Jumping between the 4-pin XLR and the 6.3mm headphone sockets, the sound does change a little bit. So what I've started off describing is from the 4-pin XLR output, and that has the Halo feedback technology. I am going to go into this in detail later, but what I'll just say for now is that the Halo feedback approach is going to use any electrical kind of signals or interference, whatever you want to call it, any kind of electrical content coming back from the speaker driver within your headphones. And theoretically, it's going to try and counteract those and cancel them out as a part of the headphone circuit. So that's active on the 4-pin XLR, it's not active on the 6.3mm output. Otherwise, both outputs are identical in terms of power output, etc. And so you can very quickly switch between the 4-pin XLR and the 6.3mm, and they are a bit different. The sound, as I've already described it from the 4-pin XLR, is clean, crisp with a wonderful image focus. And moving over to the 6.3mm, I think it brings just a little bit more smoothness to the sound, a bit more warmth, and a bit less separation. I don't think it's quite as good as the 4-pin XLR, but it's not bad. It's still a very enjoyable sound, but if I had the choice, I would be choosing the 4-pin XLR. So this is not a case where the amplifier's performance drops off drastically with the 6.3mm mode. I think what's actually happening is it's really solid in 6.3mm mode, and then it just gets better in 4-pin XLR, possibly thanks to the Halo technology. But as is always the case, I can stand here and say this amplifier sounds good, but without context, it's hard to know just how good. And is it worth the $220, or are there other contenders for less or a little bit more that are a better choice to spend your money on? So let's fly through some comparisons now and find out. The first comparison I reached for was the Schiit Audio Magni Plus. This is a $109 headphone amplifier from Schiit Audio. It's also fully discrete. It's also really powerful despite its compact size. And so for $210 less than the Midgard, I was interested to see how this one performed. And the first thing I'd say is that running from the single-ended output of both, so using the 6.3mm here because that's all it's got, and the 6.3mm here, they're very difficult to separate these two amps. I think the Midgard probably had a slight edge on clarity, but it's close enough that I don't think I'd pick it blind. On the other hand, when you do go over to the 4-pin XLR output from the Midgard, it definitely steps ahead in terms of clarity and separation, as you'd expect from what I've already said. I think the stage also gets a bit bigger. Maybe it just gets wider and not any further depth, but it definitely felt bigger to me as I jumped between them. And I think tonally, they're pretty much identical amplifiers. From a tonal point of view, their level of neutrality, smoothness, warmth, coolness, all those factors, I think they're identical. And so what's basically going on here is that by paying the extra $210, you're getting a more technical or technically capable amplifier. So you're keeping the exact same sound if you know the Magni Plus and you like it. You're keeping exactly that same sound and just dialing up those technical areas like clarity, separation, soundstage. And that means that it's a good amplifier to go to the Midgard. Whether it's worth $210, I'm going to have to leave that one up to you. It's definitely a better amp. It also gives you balanced connections if that matters to you. But beyond that, as I said, I'll have to leave it up to you whether it's worth the extra money. And so from there, we go to what I thought was a very interesting comparison on paper. And that's to put the Midgard here up against the very similar sized and quite similar priced Schiit Asgard 3. The Asgard 3 is $60 more than the Midgard. And so it comes in at $279. It's a bit taller, but otherwise the same footprint as you can see here. And the Asgard 3 has long been one of my favourite headphone amps in this price segment because the sound is just very organic, natural and enveloping. It is a bit warmer and richer than some other options on the market, but that's part of why I love it. And therefore, as you'd expect, when I compared these two, there is a significant tonal difference. The Asgard 3 is noticeably warmer and richer sounding than the Midgard. On a track like Red Rain by Peter Gabriel, what I found was that the tonality of the Midgard being a bit cleaner, a bit more neutral, a bit more clarity focused, that allowed more texture and more detail to come through. I don't necessarily think that the Asgard 3 isn't producing it, but you don't notice it as much because it has got that thicker sound. What that translates to is that on an orchestral track like Red Rain, the Midgard brings forward a bit more of the bite and the texture of the strings. I was also more easily able to hear the different textures and characters of sounds like the percussion and the brass from the orchestra. And none of this is to say that the Asgard 3 isn't good in that area, but the Midgard is a step better, I think, for clarity. On the other hand, the Asgard 3 was producing a better sense of depth in the soundstage, and I felt like there was a better sense therefore of the depth and layering of instruments. Mid-range sounds, kind of the key focal sounds in the center of the soundstage, came just a little bit closer on the Asgard 3 compared to the Midgard, and I think that actually helped produce more sense of depth and layering in the soundstage, and it never got congested or in my face. So in other words, it's all positive from the Asgard 3 in terms of staging, and therefore it's going to come down to which you prefer. Do you prefer more depth and layering, or do you prefer more sense of clarity, more sense of separation of sounds, more in the left-right plane? I think both are wonderful headphone amps. It's hard to split them in terms of which one's performing better or worse because they both have their strengths. It is worth mentioning, with the Asgard 3 being single-ended only, that if you do compare the single-ended of the Midgard versus the single-ended of the Asgard 3, what you'll find is that the tonality of the Asgard 3 is still a bit richer and warmer still. So remember before I said that the 6.3 from the Midgard is a bit smoother and a bit richer than the 4.4mm. So what we're saying here is that going from the 4.4 to the 6.3 on the Midgard, you go from being very clarity focused to a little bit smoother. And then if you go to the Asgard 3, you get a bit smoother still. But the key difference here is that I don't feel like you're taking a step back in clarity, resolution, etc. like you did with the Magni Plus. With the Magni Plus, it was definitely a step down in clarity and resolution. With the Asgard 3, I feel like it's just a change in tonality. And so I think ultimately both of these are fantastic headphone amps. I think also the Midgard is going to suit more people. I think its more neutral tuning is going to be to most people's liking. I certainly love the Asgard 3 sound, but I know that some people find it a bit too rich and warm. And so many, I think, will prefer the Midgard. It's also cheaper, which helps. It's also got balanced connections, which might help. And so I think probably the Midgard comes out in front here. But it's not to say that the Asgard 3 is a lesser amp, it's probably just a bit more specialised, a bit more niche for those that know they want that specific sound. And so at this point, what we've been talking about are all discrete design amplifiers, meaning, as I said before, individual transistors, resistors, etc. And so before I wrapped up the comparisons, I wanted to look for one more headphone amplifier, something that went outside the world of Schiit audio and also into the world of integrated op amps. And the one that I settled on was the Geshelli Labs E2. This is a wonderful amplifier in its own right. It's designed, as I've already said, around integrated op amps instead of being discrete. It's also a fully balanced amplifier from back to front. It's actually only balanced. There's no 6.3mm here. And the E2 comes in at $230 depending on the case you choose. With Geshelli Labs, you can choose an aluminium case or a wooden case. You can go all custom. You can choose color schemes, all that sort of thing. But it's going to come in at roughly around about $230, making it $11 more than the Midgard. And I started off comparing these two, listening to Skylark by Aretha Franklin, but honestly I wasn't able to separate them much with this track. They both sounded quite similar. I felt like the soundstage wasn't giving me a lot of information or a lot of difference between them. And so I pretty quickly dropped that track and moved over to something a bit busier, a bit more modern. Not that modern means better recording, it's just a matter of finding something different. And what I landed on was Life Goes On by the Gym Class Heroes. And this ended up being a really nice comparison track for these two, because it's a much busier track than Skylark. And what it showed me was that on that really busy kind of track, the Midgard just felt more at ease. There's actually not a massive difference between these amplifiers. They do sound pretty similar across the board. But as I went back and forth, I just felt like there was a bit more sense of space, not in terms of a larger overall soundstage, but each individual instrument felt like it had just a little bit more space around it with the Midgard. There may have also been just a little bit more depth in the soundstage from the Midgard, and it just made everything easier to take in as a listening experience. So again, we're in a situation where we've got two excellent headphone amps, and I think the Midgard just pulls ahead because of that sense of ease rather than any major kind of technical or tonal difference. They're both delivering much the same sound, it's just the Midgard was more enjoyable to listen to. And so this brings us to a point where I'm really comfortable saying I think the Midgard is a great amplifier. If you saw my review of the previous version of the Midgard, which was known as the Magnus, I was never really sold on the Magnus. But for me, the Midgard is a really enjoyable amplifier. It is an amplifier that I would probably want to focus on using the 4-pin XLR output. Not that the 6.3mm is bad, but the 4-pin XLR is just better. And so if you're in a position where your headphones can or do already have a 4-pin XLR termination, then I think the Midgard is definitely one you should consider. And if you are considering it, let's do a quick device tour, and then I'll talk about the Halo technology and what I found when I conducted my measurements. Kicking off the device tour, we've got on the front just two buttons, a volume knob, a 6.3mm, and a 4-pin XLR output. The two buttons are to choose your input, so you can choose between the XLR or the RCA inputs, and then you've also got a gain switch on the front too. That's really it, and then volume of course. If we then swing around to the back, we've got XLR input, RCA input, XLR output, RCA output, and power switch, as is the Schiit way. And so what this means is that this is a fully featured preamp as well as a headphone amp. The Halo technology is not operating on the preamp circuit. So what you're going to get out of the preamp stage is much like what I described from the 6.3mm output. In as much as it's clean, it's solid, it's not going to set the world on fire as a preamp, but at $219 it's going to be a really solid option to run to a pair of active speakers on a desktop, maybe do a separate power amplifier, whatever it is that you need it for. And while we're talking about the preamp, it's also worth mentioning that there is no preamp switch on this. So these will be running all the time, and therefore you need a way to switch on or off whatever your external source is that the preamp connects to. And so that's it for the device tour. The final thing to mention here is that the Halo technology is kind of interesting. To listen to the difference between the 6.3mm and the 4-pin XLR output, it's absolutely doing something. The question for me is exactly what's it doing? What the Halo technology is intended to do is essentially cancel out any of the feedback electromagnetic information that comes from a moving driver in a headphone. And the way this works is that in a headphone driver setup, you've got a coil of wire, that's being the voice coil, and that's moving inside a circular magnet. So a donut-shaped magnet, you could think of it as. And so as the musical signal flows through the voice coil, it's going to move in relation to the electromagnetic field that it creates, that being the musical signal, and its interaction with the magnets. Now, if that was all we had to worry about, there'd be no need for the Halo. But what also happens in a speaker driver is that after it completes any motion that's been created by the musical signal, the mechanical tension or elasticity in the suspension of the driver means that it'll often have a little bit of a wobble afterwards. And so with that wobble, as the voice coil is continuing to move within that donut magnet, it's creating its own magnetic field that's then going to get fed back into the amplifier. And so all of a sudden, the driver in your headphones is actually generating noise of its own. Now, if we come back to the Halo technology in the Midgard, what that's intended to do is essentially look at the signal that's coming back from the headphone and look for any distortion being created by that electromagnetic kind of wobbling effect. It will then send an opposite signal to that wobble and theoretically try to cancel it out. Now, I don't know how that's going to work in terms of the delay, because obviously by the time the wobble has happened to produce the signal that goes back to the amplifier, for it then to come back out of the amplifier and into the headphone while there's also new musical signal coming, I'm not sure how that really works from a physics point of view. And that might explain the results of the measurements that I've taken, because the measurements didn't really tell me very much. Before I tell you a bit more about the measurements, the final thing I'll say is that the reason it's called the Halo system, or the Halo technology, is because it's essentially creating a loop or a ring where the amplifier and your headphones are all part of one big circuit. So that's where the name came from, and that's the theory behind how it might work. But as I said, the results in terms of measurements were pretty inconclusive, whereas the listening results definitely seemed to pay off with something. One of the things Schiit Audio were interested in getting was a series of measurements from people that bought the Midgard. I, of course, offered to share some with Schiit Audio. And when I emailed Jason Stoddard with my initial findings, he wasn't surprised to hear that my findings weren't particularly telling. And that's because when I took multiple measurements with multiple headphones in different situations and setups, the results were kind of hard to pick what was going on. The total harmonic distortion changed every time that I went between the 6.3 and the 4-pin XLR, but it didn't necessarily reduce. Sometimes it even went up. But what was really interesting was that it seemed like the Halo technology was maybe taking some frequencies out, but not fixing others. Maybe it was adding distortion in some places whilst removing it in others. It was really hard to know. As I said, it was a very, very small shift across the board. It's not like it's suddenly going to make your headphones super clean or super noisy. What I would actually put it down to is the fact that it probably doesn't make any significant difference at all in terms of distortion figures. In terms of how the device sounds, it definitely does. And so this is one of those situations where I think probably what we're getting here is one of those areas where we don't necessarily know what it is to measure. Maybe you need more advanced measurement rigs than what I have in order to get it precise and consistent enough to really nail it down, because I would describe all the measurements I did as completely inconclusive. The good news is that it's doing something that sounds great. That's all I really care about. And so just to reiterate what I said earlier, I think the Midgard is an absolutely fantastic choice at $219. And I'd go so far as to say, I don't think I can think of a better headphone amplifier for that money. It's easily gone up against and either matched or bested all the other amplifiers that I think of as excellent at that price point, namely the Asgard 3 and the Geshelli Labs E2. Having compared both of those in the past to other amplifiers from SMSL and Topping, I don't think there's a single amplifier that I've come across that I would choose over the Midgard. And so if you're in the market for a $200 odd US headphone amplifier and or preamp, the Midgard is definitely one that I think you should take a look at. And so as always, I hope you found this video useful, helpful and informative. If you have, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.